Well, hi everyone. My name is Jasmine Chu. I am a manager with RMI's US program, and I wanted to welcome all of you to our webinar on driving economic development with affordable power. Very excited. We have an awesome lineup of panelists and speakers, and I'm excited to introduce them shortly. But first, I wanted to start off with a little bit of context setting for this big topic. Um, as competition for new industrial facilities, data centers, and other large energy users intensifies across the country, the cost, reliability, and speed of power delivery are becoming very critical factors in siting decisions that are worth billions of dollars in capital investments. So today we're going to explore how states can invest in electricity that is affordable, abundant, and reliable, which can then strengthen economic development initiatives. So a few quick logistical notes up top. This session is being recorded and will be posted to our event page within 24 hours. If you have any questions, please drop those in the Q&A box, which you can find at the bottom of your Zoom window, and we'll get to as many of those as we can during this webinar. That being said, this webinar is 1 hour long. We'll start with a level setting presentation about the topic, followed by an awesome panel discussion with our guest speakers. And then we will have time at the end for the questions that you submit through the Q&A box. So with that, I'd first like to bring up to the virtual stage our first speaker, my colleague at RMI, Matthew Land, who is a senior associate on RMI's US program. Matthew has worked extensively in state electricity affordability and will present on why this is emerging as a central priority for economic developers, as well as state energy leaders. He will set the stage on what's happening with electricity costs across the country, what's driving those costs now, and what policy levers that states have to address and lower these costs. So, Matthew, I'll go ahead and let you take it away.
Great. Thanks, Jasmine. Appreciate the kind introduction. I'm super excited to be speaking with you all today about electricity affordability trends and policy approaches in the US. And as Jasmine mentioned, I have about 15 minutes of content. I'll set the stage before we turn it over to our great panel. So I'm just going to go ahead and get started. John, can you go to the next slide, please? Thank you. So I have three main topics that I want to cover today. First, we'll be unpacking some trends and understanding what is happening to electricity prices and affordability around the country. Next, with that in mind, I'll talk about some of the key cost drivers driving electricity prices. And then lastly, I'll talk about some of the actions that policymakers around the country are taking to promote affordability. You can go to the next slide. Great. So here we can see the national trend in inflation-adjusted electricity prices by sector over the last 20 years, as well as forecasted prices for the next 2 years. And there are a few main takeaways from this slide. The first is that, as you can see, inflation-adjusted prices have generally remained flat or even decreased over the last 20 years in most sectors. Now, we do see that residential prices have actually increased. So if we look at just this 2006 to 2025 timeframe, residential real prices have increased about 4%, but prices in the commercial and industrial sectors have actually decreased about 11 to 12%. And between this 2010 to 2020 timeframe, prices in most sectors generally actually grew slower than inflation. But I want to turn your attention to this last 5-ish year time period. And that's where we see a slight departure of this trend of downward inflation-adjusted prices or flat inflation-adjusted prices. This is particularly notable in the residential sector. So again, as I mentioned, residential sector prices have climbed to their highest level in the last 20 years. And this has contributed to that crunch on households that we've seen. Commercial and industrial prices have been a bit more volatile over this time period, but they've kind of slightly departed this, noticeable downward trend that they were experiencing in the last 15 or so years before then. So in the last 5 years, electricity prices or inflation-adjusted electricity prices have grown about 6.6% in the residential sector. They've grown about 0.5% in the commercial sector and about 1% in the industrial sector. So Although those absolute prices are only slightly higher or actually lower than they were 20 years ago, this near-term price increase has definitely been a major factor. I also want to touch on a few possible reasons why there's this divergence between residential and commercial and industrial prices. So there are a few possible reasons for this. First is that residential customers generally bear the brunt of a lot of the costs to upgrade or repair or maintain the distribution system, because ultimately they're responsible for a lot of that infrastructure. And as I'll get to later, this distribution system investment has been a key cost driver lately. Second, lower rates for commercial and industrial customers might be more aligned with economic and political agendas to support economic development. And then lastly, large commercial and industrial customers in particular might have more economic and political capital to advocate for lower rates. So, for example, more power to intervene in regulatory processes, or in the case of some customers, actually negotiate special contracts or prices. And then the last takeaway on the slide that is perhaps the most important is that just looking at this national average picture really obscures substantial variation that's occurring between states. And that's where I want to go to next if we can advance the slide. So here we're just looking at this last 5-year time period, and we can see the growth in inflation adjusted prices by sector and state. First, we see that there is a strong, more persistent pattern of residential price increases by states. This is indicated by more red and less blue or less tan color. Prices across all sectors seem to have increased the most in the East Coast and in the West Coast, while in the Mountain West and Great Plains states, they've actually decreased in real terms. There is a lot more variability as well in commercial and industrial price growth between states, and this is particularly true for industrial prices. So looking at this chart on the left, we see that inflation-adjusted electricity prices in the industrial sector have grown about 60% in Connecticut over the last 5 years, but other states have seen increase or decreases of 20% or higher. Now, again, in real terms, prices are only slightly higher now than 20 years ago in the residential sector, and they're actually lower in the commercial and industrial sectors. But this recent trend of significant price increases in some states has definitely strained households and businesses. This is why policymakers are heavily focused on this topic. Go to the next slide, please. So with that in mind, what are some of the major factors driving these costs historically? Next slide. We can think of this in 3 main buckets. First, we have our sources or categories of cost. These are all the costs it takes to transmit and produce that electricity and deliver it to customers. So, for example, the cost of fuels or the cost of the poles and wires to distribute that electricity. Next, we have these source of costs being exacerbated by system and market failures. So, for example, in many parts of the country, we have slow and opaque interconnection processes that prevent new generation from connecting to the grid and are contributing to price increases. Similarly, we have misaligned utility incentives and cost recovery mechanisms that might incentivize utilities to overinvest in new infrastructure when there are more cost-efficient solutions available. And then lastly, we have these macroeconomic drivers that are worsening some of these trends. So these are things like load growth, supply chain constraints, tariffs, and other factors. And we seem to have this perfect storm brewing right now, where we have these long-standing stressors, the system failures that have existed for a while, being exacerbated by these new and emerging drivers that are all contributing to price increases. Go to the next slide. In RMI, we produced an electricity affordability toolkit, and we distilled this into 5 key cost drivers, which you can see here on the slide. These are aging grid infrastructure, load growth, extreme weather and wildfires, fuel price volatility, and misaligned utility incentives. Now, critically, each of these drivers is going to have a different level of impact and significance in different states. So, for example, a state like Michigan is investing quite heavily in its distribution system infrastructure, and that's a major driver for them. But they don't have the same price impacts coming from wildfires as a state like California does. I also want to touch on fuel price volatility and load growth specifically, as these are 2 factors that can actually lead to price increases or decreases depending on the situation. So, for example, a lot of states experienced price increases due to volatile and high natural gas prices stemming from the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But these prices could also decrease, and that could lead to lower prices, lower electricity prices, that is. And similarly, in some states, load growth can actually reduce prices if we're able to spread its fixed costs over a greater number of kilowatt hours. But definitely, we're seeing in some states, particularly in the PJM region, they're already experiencing price increases due to load growth outstripping supply. And this trend could definitely extend to other states as we look in the next 5, 10, 15 years. You can go to the next slide, please. Now, taking a step back from those 5 key cost drivers, I want to briefly chat about these 2 topics and their relationship with price growth. First, looking at the chart on the left, we see that there's not a strong or clear correlation between renewable energy deployment and inflation-adjusted electricity prices. So this shows the average retail price of electricity growth over the last 5 years compared to the change in wind and solar generation in a state. And we see that there isn't really a clear positive or negative relationship between these 2 factors. And then secondly, we also see that there's not quite a clear relationship between data center load growth specifically and price increases over the last 5 years. Now, this reflects that comment I just made about load growth potentially contributing to price increases or decreases. But I do want to definitely touch on that data center load growth has already contributed to price increases, again, particularly in regions like PJM. And it's possible that this dynamic changes as we look to the future if this data center load growth outstrips the available supply and the ability how quick we can produce new supply to meet that demand. We can go to the next slide, please. So armed with this information on these trends and cost drivers, how can states address energy affordability, and particularly in the lens of economic development, what are some of the actions states are already taking? Next slide, please. First, there are a lot of different decision makers that play a role in addressing energy affordability. And here we list a few of the state actors. So legislatures play a critical role in providing direction, guardrails, and funding to other organizations, other agencies, as well as public utility commissions. Those public utility commissions also play a huge role in the ultimate design, implementation, and enforcement of policies. And of course, they're actually tasked with providing that utility oversight and ensuring rates are adjusted reasonably for customers. State administrations, so governor's offices, state energy offices, etc., are critical in setting these high-level goals and strategy, and they can also effectively coordinate between a variety of different actors. So, for example, governors in the PJM states came together to issue a PJM state principles, which will help address the affordability and reliability challenges facing the region. And then lastly, RTOs or ISOs, so PJM, MISO, etc., set market rules and manage system operations. And this plays a key role in ultimately determining some of those upstream system costs, for example, interregional transmission, which get passed down to consumers. We can go to the next slide. At RMI, we've developed this 4-part framework for holistic affordability action that takes place all the way from the system level down to the customer level. First, starting at the left, we have cost control actions. These are things like utility business model reform or siting and permitting reform that help manage the overall size of the pie and incentivize efficient spending. In the middle, we have cost distribution actions, which are about efficiently distributing costs to customers and potentially non-customers to support for them. A great example of a cost distribution action would be a large load tariff that's efficiently distributing the costs born or coming from a new large load like a data center between that data center and existing customers. Customer agency actions then ultimately provide customers with more options to manage and control their own energy use. So an easy example here is energy efficiency. And then lastly, running through each of these actions, it's critical to embed safeguards that protect the most vulnerable customers who are experiencing the worst forms of energy insecurity. Go to the next slide, please. So in light of this framework, and again, in this lens of economic development, how are some states taking action to promote affordability? Here we highlight a few notable examples, but there are definitely a wealth of examples out there, and these are just a few. So in Indiana, Governor Braun issued an executive order in June 2025 creating a strategic energy growth task force. This task force has a number of actions it's ultimately tasked with implementing, but some of them include creating an energy growth plan that's specifically focused on reliability and affordability to support economic development in the state. This includes identifying opportunities for state and industry leaders to collaborate and deploy new technologies. And it also includes the task force supporting the Indiana Economic Development Corporation in creating strategic clean industrial hubs throughout the state. Turning to Maryland, Governor Moore announced the Lower Bills and Local Power Act as part of his 2026 legislative agenda. And this legislation includes $10 million of investment in strategic energy investment fund, which will help build new high voltage transmission and battery storage projects in the state. And it would also create this solar and STEM storage gap financing program to spur development of clean energy projects in the state and contribute to job growth. And then lastly, Governor Shapiro's lightning plan for Pennsylvania is heavily focused on deploying clean energy in the state, creating jobs, and lowering costs for customers. So, for example, the plan would create a state siting and permitting board to facilitate deployment of energy projects in the state. It also includes a suite of tax credits for strategic industries like clean hydrogen and sustainable aviation fuel to promote economic development, promote jobs, and lower costs for customers. We can go to the next slide, please. So that's all that I have for you. Thanks all for listening. Please feel free to email with any questions or pop them in the Q&A. I'll be monitoring that as we turn it over to the panel. But for now, I want to hand it back over to Jasmine so we can get started with our star panel.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Matthew. Really appreciate the landscape of what you've been able to research and explore with what states have taken action on. And as Matthew just said, if anyone has any questions or thoughts about the insights that Matthew just laid out, feel free to put those in the Q&A. Matthew, I already know that Vin has put in a great question to talk through utility incentives. So thanks in advance for answering that. Now I'm very excited to invite our guest speakers today. Combined, they have decades of experience in the energy and economic development sectors, and they offer unique perspectives about implementation on the ground and expertise in power systems. So first up, we have Jennifer Munt, Assistant Secretary for Energy and Infrastructure at the North Carolina Department of Commerce. Next, we have Rebecca Puck-Stare, who goes by Puck, Director at the New Mexico State Energy Office. And finally, we have Kaspris Spokas, who is the Director of the Electricity Program at the Clean Air Task Force. Thank you all for your generosity and time in being here with us and engaging in this interesting discussion. As we just heard from Matthew, there are a lot of nuances and there's a lot of variation across the US. So I'm excited to dive in deeper with all of you. So to start, perhaps with Jennifer, can each of you introduce yourselves, briefly describe your role, and from where you sit, share what affordable power means for economic development? We can start with Jennifer, then go to Puck and Kaspris.
Sounds great. Thank you, Jasmine, and to the RMI team for the opportunity to join you all this afternoon. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Jennifer Munt, and as Jasmine said, I'm serving in the North Carolina Department of Commerce as our Assistant Secretary for Energy and Infrastructure, where our office intends to provide guidance to communities, businesses, policymakers, and pretty much all stakeholders that touch energy on the complex issues that they face in today's dynamic and ever-evolving energy economy. We in North Carolina are at the intersection of three major economic trends that are affecting our electric power sector right now, including booming demand from computing power increases and data centers, the reshoring of significant heavy manufacturing and industrial activity in the state, as well as experiencing exponential population growth. We rank third in the number of people that we've added to our state since 2020 across the nation. So, Jasmine, to your question about affordability or affordable power and what that means, we know in North Carolina that access to affordable, reliable, and diverse energy resources will determine North Carolina North Carolina's ability to capture future economic opportunities as the United States races to build more resilient domestic supply chains, maintain our country's competitive edge in artificial intelligence, and as we as a nation in each state navigate the global stresses that are impeding the broader energy markets. And so affordability is key, but there are a whole lot of other variables that impact the work that we do day to day. So thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Jennifer. And yeah, North Carolina does seem to be the hottest place to live these days. No offense, Puck. I also love New Mexico. But Puck, I would like to bring you in here to introduce yourself and talk about what affordable power means from your perspective too.
Sure, and thanks to the RMI team for hosting this event. I always appreciate the high caliber thinking and content that you all issue, so I'm honored to be here. So my name is Puck Stair, and I'm the director of the State Energy Office in New Mexico, and my office oversees the transition to New Mexico's 100% clean energy future. And out here in the sunny West, that has a special meaning for us, is that we are an energy powerhouse. So many of you know that we are the #2 oil and gas producer for the state of New Mexico, right after Texas. But we're also in the top 10 for wind. We're in the top 5 for solar. And I think we're #6 in geothermal potential. And we also, like Jennifer, sit at an intersection. But in our case, the intersection is of the 3 national grids: the Eastern Connection, the Western Connection, and ERCOT. So as the nation thinks about electrifying and maybe thinking about national grid build out, we are happy to export our abundant, hopefully cheap and affordable electrons, not only for ourselves, but export them to the rest of the country. And you ask a big question, so I'm going to give you a big answer and then remind you also that the spaceport also resides here in New Mexico. So sometimes we can think on a kind of galactic scale. So for us here, affordable energy, I think I would call out a parallel to information and what the internet has done for information over the last 10 years, making it abundant, affordable, essentially free. And we'd love to see electricity follow the same path to like truly unleash energy for humanity. And so that would, for here in Mexico, allow us to like desalinize the Permian Ocean that's underneath our surface, but also unleash AI to give everyone like a custom doctor and, custom cures for cancer, turbocharge manufacturing, and to be really far out there, fuel the trips that hopefully humanity will take, not to Mars, but back from Mars to Earth. We have to have renewables to do that, and otherwise move us from our Kardashev level 0 galactic civilization to a level 1. So hi from Roswell in the spaceport state.
Thank you, Puck. And also appreciate you thinking big for this conversation. And finally, Casperus, I wanted to bring you in here to introduce yourself and the work you've done at Clean Air Task Force.
Sure. Well, thank you and RMI for having me and gathering just a great panel here today. So my name is Casper Spokus. I'm the director of the electricity program at Clean Air Task Force, or CATF as we're often called. CATF is a global nonprofit organization where we work to safeguard against the worst impacts of climate change and catalyze both rapid development but also deployment of low carbon energy and other climate protecting technologies. For context, the electricity program specifically at CATF covers most things: power system analytics, market design, and regulatory reform in the US and Europe and other parts of the world. In the US specifically, we work on both federal and state policy across the country and do advocacy in those regions. So for me, affordable power means, long-term access to reliable and resilient electricity supply at a cost that supports both local sectors, businesses, economic development, and also similarly provides fair and reasonable rates for residential households. And to me, this isn't just a US issue, it's a global issue, right? I think overall increasing reliable and affordable power supply is key for both economic development locally, but also global development and global security. And so when we work in the US, we not only have the perspective of what is necessary locally to achieve goals, but what are some of the larger technological advances, process advances that might scale globally and inspire global change that's a benefit to everyone.
Awesome. Thank you for that, and appreciate that for grounding us in the conversation today. And I'm also really appreciating the variety of perspectives we have here because Puck and Jennifer, I feel like you both offer unique perspectives coming from states, and Casper's, you've done a lot of research and thought leadership around this too. Casper's, the first question we have prepared actually is for you, and Matthew did a great job of laying this out in his presentation, but there's a tendency to want to blame rising electricity prices on one thing. But we did see in Matthew's presentation that there are a slew of things that can drive up costs. So I'm curious from your analysis and the settings that you've been in, what are these like key drivers really, and what do people most often get wrong in these debates?
Yeah, happy to provide a little bit more context. I think Matthew did a great job outlining the high-level trends and characterizing some of the key drivers. In that, you saw that prices aren't rising uniformly everywhere. So this isn't just a blanket problem. And given all the drivers and regional specificity of some of them, it's not surprising that attempts to create a simple narrative go wrong. You simply can't explain electricity price trends with a bumper sticker here. So looking at trends and taking a little bit of a step further, what are some of the trends we see in historical data? And then I'll touch on, what we should be considering beyond historical data towards the future and some of the trends that are emerging. So you mentioned, renewables. For now, and as far as we can see in the data, there's no correlation between renewable deployment and cost increases. In fact, some of the largest increases in renewables in certain states, like Texas, Iowa, New Mexico, South Dakota, actually saw the largest decreases in their rates. And that's not all to say that that all came from just that. There are multiple factors driving this. But overall, there's no correlation here. If renewables are market driven, cost competitive, rates decline. For states that have binding clean electricity standards, you might start seeing positive prices in renewable energy credits, clean energy credits that will be part of people's bills. And so in states with very ambitious clean energy goals and low quality resources, they're the most at risk for long-term cost increases. However, even so, the story isn't that straightforward, right? Clean energy may have other benefits that are not quantified in a credit price. This could be price hedging and shielding customers from fuel price volatility, air quality benefits, local economic developments. We know a lot of industries are demanding clean power for their operations, and those are simply not captured in credit costs. And so the story isn't even that straightforward there. And with changes in technology and planning, those potential cost premiums may change quite significantly, even at very high, ambitious clean electricity standards. The other one we see very clearly is gas prices, right? Wholesale electricity prices in the deregulated regions almost perfectly correlate with delivered natural gas prices. This is because gas often sets the marginal generator, or the marginal generator that sets the price. And so since 2010, as gas prices have steadily declined, wholesale electricity prices have followed. However, today's situation also shows us the flip side of this in that, we're still quite exposed to fossil fuel volatility in electricity costs. And overall, I'm not an oil and gas expert, but with increasing liquefied natural gas export capacity, the US is going to get more tied to global markets for that input. Matthew mentioned load, and he mentioned, data shows generally that states with negative or low load growth, saw increases in rates historically, while states with positive load growth experienced decreases. Again, New Mexico being a leader here in the data. Load growth can, if the conditions are right and cost allocation is accurate, really decrease rates as you spread already sunk fixed, transmission and distribution costs over a larger rate base, right? That benefits everyone. The opposite is also true. Notoriously, California's early net metering policies led to rate increases as the rate base shrunk, and the same costs had to be recovered from less load, in addition to complications with wildfire costs that really drove up prices in that state. And that's not to say net metering can't be done well. As long as you're accounting for some of the distributional impacts and some of the system that people are still paying for when they're developing behind the meter generation, that could still be done fairly. And so it's clear that a well-managed load growth, in a system with headroom can reduce costs. In deregulated markets, things get a little bit more tricky. Load growth, coupled with challenges to deploy new energy generation, like interconnection queue delays, permitting, and so on, can tend to increase market prices for everyone. And there are also knock-on effects of load growth that just permeate the whole system. Supply chains, especially for gas turbines right now, are quite tight, and costs have gone up. And that might be a sticky problem kind of going forward. And then last, Matthew also mentioned transmission distribution. Those are the sections where we've seen the most capital increase over the last couple of decades, while congestion still remains high. So I think it's pretty clear that, how those investments are being made needs revamping, and a lot of people, including others at Clean Air Task Force or infrastructure and legal teams, work on improving transmission planning. So just very quickly, that's, the past. Looking at the future, just a few things, should be emphasized. I think one thing is it is far too early to have seen most of the impacts of the ongoing and upcoming demand growth in the price data. Load is the highest it has ever been in decades. It's also the most uncertain it has in many decades. I think most people consider load growth and associate it all to be coming from data centers. Nationally, it's actually more around 50%. Now, there are key states like Virginia, Texas, where a lot of it is coming from data centers, but not entirely. That data center portion is also highly uncertain. When you look at global chip orders and compare that to expected load forecasts, it's clear there are duplicative requests that are inflating load. And so relatedly, one thing that we're seeing slowly uptick is capital spending for utilities is substantially higher in the last few years than it's been in the past decade. Investor-owned utility rate increases have hit their highest levels in 40 years, and state utility regulators have approved the largest fraction of utility rate increases over the last 5 years than historically has ever been the case. And so that combination of both load growth, high cost, is both kind of a risk and opportunity for most states that will have to manage going forward. And so I really encourage people to review some of the good work done by RMI, also by Lawrence Berkeley National Lab and Brattle Group that have been publishing these annual retail rate data driven reports that I think are really good. Most recent 2025 version was just released several weeks ago. Those are really great resources for people who want to dive into specific trends and kind of see where things are going.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Casper. I think you offered a lot of detail there. So hard to zero in on one thing because, what I heard you mention is load growth driven by data centers that have more recently come to more public discussion, as well as conflict that's happening globally. So appreciate all of the detail you just shared, and I think there's a lot to dive into. Wanted to connect it to our next question for Jennifer, because of some of the pressures, Caspers, that you just mentioned are popping up in North Carolina. So Jennifer, so North Carolina has been one of the most active states, as you just shared, recruiting clean energy manufacturing, and now you're seeing significant price pressure from the manufacturing side, plus population growth and data center demand and load growth. So I'm curious, from your standpoint, what kinds of projects are you seeing interest in right now, and how often is power availability and cost becoming the deciding factor, or maybe like a very, very influential factor?
Sure. So I'll take the last part first and then give a couple of examples of what we're seeing here. Earlier this week, the annual corporate and consultant survey on site selection was released, where they asked respondents what are the factors that they most attribute to their site selections ultimately. And this year, respondents reported, quote, electric power availability at scale was the number 2 factor in site selection, only following availability of a skilled workforce. I would note that last year, energy availability ranked first among those surveyed, and energy cost ranks 6th. And so we are finely attuned to those factors that are driving site selection, industry decisions, et cetera, when they choose to locate here. To the top of your question, Jasmine, I'm extremely proud of the success that North Carolina has achieved over the past 8 to 10 years in recruiting clean energy manufacturing to the state. Over that time, we've seen nearly $30 billion in investment, tens of thousands of jobs that are committed with those investments that are strewn across the state from the mountains to the coast, injecting opportunity into every corner, which is what we want to see from our perspective. We anticipate that the investments in energy will continue into this year. And what we've seen thus far in just the first, quarter plus of 2026 are new investments in energy production and equipment that are meeting the moment that we are experiencing right now. And so these companies, they are making these announcements for new manufacturing and production that are in direct response to the opportunities or pressures that we're all experiencing in the energy market. And I have 2 quick examples, if you'll honor me the time. Just 2 weeks ago, a Brazilian company called Tisea Energy, they announced their first U.S. manufacturing plant here in Eden, North Carolina, which is like in north central North Carolina, creating 160 jobs, $25 million in investment. Tisea is planning to manufacture its voltage regulators, which is equipment that helps support grid stability, power quality, and system reliability. They currently, from their Brazilian headquarters, they support and provide products to many U.S. utilities, and now they'll be able to make domestic produced products and equipment right here in the U.S. in North Carolina and send those to their customers here in the United States. If you allow me, I want to just read you a quick quote from the CEO in making the announcement. He said that he values, quote, the opportunity to support the modernization of the U.S. power grid. This facility will be dedicated to serving the U.S. market and will allow us to work more closely with utilities as they upgrade and modernize their distribution networks. I think that tells the story of what we're seeing in terms of investment in North Carolina. We'll layer onto that, 6 weeks ago, a company called U.S. Forge Rings announced its plan to invest up to $875 million in northeastern North Carolina in a rural county and anticipate creating 625 jobs. They are an integrated one-stop shop for manufacturing of specialty steel products, large diameter steel fabrication. Think products like specialty tubulars, forgings for power reactors, heat exchangers, etc. Similarly, their CEO is looking forward to bringing good paying jobs back to America, substituting imports and lowering dependency on foreign suppliers, and help, quote, lower the uncertainty in the costs and timing of building power plants and other critical infrastructure that our country very much needs. And so those are just 2 examples of companies that are leaning into the moment right now and trying to fill that gap and creating the products that are necessary in order for us to keep up with this increasing load. So.
Yeah, Jennifer, thanks so much for offering up those examples. I think they speak perfectly to the core of our discussion here is our power system is in need of investment, and congrats on this awesome investment, where a company saw value in setting up in North Carolina and want to issue products that help the US and local community members around that facility. Thanks for sharing. So Puck, I wanted to pass it off to you now. And as you just set up too, New Mexico is a very obviously energy-rich state in a lot of different ways. And the state has been investing heavily in renewables and grid modernization. So I'm curious, what kinds of large load projects like data centers, industrial facilities, are you seeing coming to the state? And talk to me too about, how New Mexico's power system plays into some of those projects and how they're and those investment decisions.
Yeah, so we have abundant electrons here. In fact, at times we have to curtail up to 30% of what we're making. The other day I was driving through one of our wind farms and all of the blades are at a stop because we have a lot of grid congestion. But nonetheless, and I will also say that our prices are the second lowest in the country. So you can have your renewable cake and eat your low cost prices too as well. And so as a result, yeah, we're seeing a lot of data centers. Another benefit is we're centrally located, so the broadband network is good for them. And also, we don't have a lot of natural disasters, so no earthquakes, no real hurricanes. Yes, we do have the occasional fire, but that'll be up in the forest because that's so we know unfortunately where the burns will happen. So we're getting a lot of data center interest, and especially because a lot of them do have clean energy commitments, and they can come here, and our grid averages anywhere from 40 to 80% renewable, depending on the time of day, of course. But it's not all roses. So data centers are new, and as they're coming into communities, one of the concerns that, of course, we have here in our desert state is water and the cooling that data centers will need. So that is being kind of worked out in real time on the ground. And just as, for example, like Meta has a data center in Las Lunas, which has done some really creative water and energy use. You can literally drive on the on the interstate and look out your window, and for kind of 5 solid minutes, you're driving by all the solar panels that are powering that particular data center. We've got some other data centers that are encountering some local resistance as well. So we're kind of in real time working through all of those resource issues. And I'm totally confident that we'll work them through and figure out a way to help data centers be good grid citizens. For example, XGS recently announced their partnership with Meta for 150 megawatts of geothermal power, which is a whole new twist on the conversation. And they are powering ahead with it.
Yeah, that's great. Congrats on that too. So next question is geared towards Jennifer and Puck. Wanted to ask you all in your respective roles, what seems to be the biggest institutional bottleneck for North Carolina and New Mexico, respectively? Is it permitting, utility planning, transmission financing, or something else, or a combination of all of those?
Who's first?
Jennifer, you've got the mic.
I'll go first. Okay. So, Jasmine, I think that's a great question. And I do think that the answer depends on who you're asking, where the biggest bottlenecks are. Utility planning vis-a-vis speed to market can be a bottleneck for energy intensive projects like heavy manufacturing and data centers. But those same projects may also experience, permitting bottlenecks because they require authorization for air emissions, water withdrawals, water discharges, land-based impacts, depending on if they're going to be, have to mitigate wetlands and streams and other things. And so those things can also create bottlenecks. But all that said, I do think that our partnerships with our utilities here help to ameliorate the bottlenecks with the utility upgrades and needs. And one place where I think we have a competitive edge in North Carolina is several years ago, we created a dedicated position that sits in our Department of Environmental Quality, which is our state's environmental regulatory agency, where that person is like a big project liaison who is able to bring experts from across the agency and all the regulatory programs to the table to work directly with the developers and their engineers and their consultants, and providing, streamlined regular communications to ensure that projects move efficiently and they're able to identify where they might run into bottlenecks and mitigate them. And so this role has been shown to be a value add, not only to the state, because we're seeing projects moving expeditiously, but also to the developers, because they're seeing their timelines decrease and they're getting their speed to market. And so they're able to, get into operations and sell their widgets. So it's been great. We have bottlenecks everywhere and we do everything we can to smooth them out.
Great. Thanks for sharing, Jennifer. Puck, can you color in some?
Yeah, in New Mexico, I think our major bottlenecks as of today are regulations with maybe an assist from planning or lack of planning, therefore. So our systems of law and our systems of money were designed for a grid built 80 years ago. And they are just not fit for purpose for today. So for example, in New Mexico, we have vertical IOUs. And so we're limited with who's allowed to sell electricity retail. And that's colliding exactly with things like balcony solar. In the last session, legislative session, there was a bill to legalize balcony solar, but it was not clear exactly what we needed to change in the law. And is it legal or illegal or just not illegal? And so we need a kind of, I think, a refresh look at some of our statute and regulations so that we unlock all of the great new resources that have come online since those laws were initially put in place. And then I think a second bottleneck, a baby bottleneck that comes along is comprehensive planning. So there's so much new going on. We have a distributed grid, distributed generation, distributed storage, new sources like geothermal. We have now lots of conversion with AC to DC, like here's my phone, which is DC powered, and this computer is AC powered, all that. And then you have GETs and dynamic line ratings. And so it's easy to kind of plan with, adding one of those at a time, but adding them all together at the same time to our grid, I think involves a different way of doing comprehensive planning. And I think would be a benefit, because if you have like dynamic line ratings is one thing, but if you add dynamic line ratings to batteries, then you sort of have more than the sum of their parts. And it's worth looking at them holistically. So regulations with an assist from comprehensive planning.
Great. Thank you for that. And, while we're thinking about some of your bottlenecks, I wanted to, ask too about New Mexico's, how you're thinking about New Mexico and its relationship between its clean energy investments and economic competitiveness. And wanted to hear a little bit more about, is electricity affordability becoming part of the state's pitch to attract new industry?
Yeah, I think that folks, maybe 5 or 10 years ago, it was an either or of either clean energy or cheap energy, but actually now it's cheap and clean tend to be in the same bucket, and it's versus whatever else. So we're finding that our emphasis on clean energy, we have a renewable portfolio standard that we've already exceeded. For now, we're staring down the hard part of getting to 100% carbon-free power by 2045, and got a lot of ideas. We're finding now that the clean energy is the cheap energy, and that's the cheapness is attractive in and of itself, but so it also is the cleanliness of and the low emissions of what we're offering. And I think the secret sauce in New Mexico is that we're fortunate here in that we have been able to build. I mentioned earlier the 5 minutes along I-25 of going by nothing but solar panels. We have the luxury of the space to do that and the land to do that out here. And that's become suddenly a real attractive thing.
Yeah, thanks, Puck. I've only had a chance to visit New Mexico once, and that was about 6 years ago, and I'm sure a lot more solar panels have gone up since then.
Do you know we
Um,
have the world's largest inverter in part of our wind farm? And it's 3 stories tall. And if you go in there, you'll be vaporized. And it's like, we had to fly in teams from Korea to build it. But yeah, the world's largest inverter is here. Who would have known?
yeah, Puck, you might have to send me the coordinates so maybe I can schedule a field trip at some point. Thank you. And Jennifer, going back to you to also talk about North Carolina and want to hone in on what makes North Carolina's energy and electricity landscape competitive when it comes to attracting new investment. I'd love to hear a little bit more about your thoughts on how North Carolina and what it's planning going into the future is adding to the state's competitiveness or competitive advantage.
Well, Jasmine, I think that's a great question. And I think I would just frame it like this. In terms of economic development and the competitive advantage that we have with electricity, with our cohort states in the South Atlantic region, according to the Energy Information Administration, we have the cheapest rates for industrial users in cents per kilowatt hour by 1.22 cents at 8.01 cents per kilowatt hour. The average in the region is 9.23 between 9 states and the District of Columbia. And so I think as a value proposition, those lower industrial electricity rates, they speak for themselves. When you layer on top of that, and now I get to pitch for North Carolina a little bit, although Puck, I'm ready to get on a plane to Santa Fe and see all of what you've got. North Carolina has been rated the best state for business 3 out of the past 4 years. And when we weren't the best, we were the second best behind Virginia, which I'm a little salty about, but we'll leave it there. We have the best manufacturing, the best manufacturing sector in terms of workforce, or I should say the largest manufacturing workforce in the Southeast. And we have the 5th largest manufacturing GDP in the country. And I think that's pretty significant, seeing as we are like the 9th or 10th most populous state, and we're going up against powerhouses like Texas and Illinois and California. So North Carolina, from a business investment perspective, is a great value proposition. We've got mountains, we've got the coast, we've got everything in between. We've got nice weather most of the time. And I think the state really sells itself. And so when you add the relatively or comparatively lower industrial electricity rates and our access to pretty abundant gas, and the fact that we have an all of the above energy resource mix that can appeal to companies that have ESG goals, where we can point to 30 to 35% of our resource mix is powered by carbon-free nuclear, and another 10 to 15% is renewable. I think it creates quite a competitive advantage.
Awesome. Thank you, Jennifer, for sharing. And Caspers, I wanted to bring you in here now that, we've heard a lot from Puck and Jennifer about the work that they're doing in their respective states and, just reflecting on what they've done to help advance and prioritize affordability in their states. When we look at the country as a whole, what can you speak a little bit more about what states can be doing, what policy measures, what tools they have to continue advancing affordability, um, and in a way that ensures fair cost allocation for everyone? Um, Wanted to pick your brain on that and what solutions states have at their disposal.
Yeah, happy to comment. I think at a high level, the best system planning, comprehensive planning to proactively evolve systems to the lowest cost outcome should be the priority in most regions, in most states, because that effectively sets the foundation. If you have a resilient, reliable, low-cost system, that provides a foundation for all customer classes to enjoy, affordable power. In terms of properly cost allocating to specific customers, the approaches really differ depending if you're in a vertically integrated state or if you're a completely deregulated state. If you're in a vertically integrated state where you have a monopoly utility, you have IRP planning, tariff design, the rates should really follow a cost causation principle. So in theory, that means that the customers driving the need for new power infrastructure effectively pay for that infrastructure rather than socializing the cost across all customers. Now, in practice, it's much more complicated. In addition to just the complication of within class subsidization, public utility commissioners often face pressures to approve utility deals with industrial players. Sometimes there are economic development deals that are kept secret or private, which is also, a transparency risk. And now we face an additional challenge where one customer within a customer class, specifically hyperscalers, risk driving up costs that are being spread out even across a customer class. And so the main tool in vertically integrated states is creating large load tariffs that try the best they can to allocate costs to the new large loads. And in some instances can also require additional types of tariff design that benefits the system as a whole. So if tariffs can incentivize flexibility for the large loads, this additional flexibility can provide system planners more options to avoid costly upgrades needed to maintain reliability for everyone. You may also specify minimum amounts of years that the large loads have to remain in the state to ensure those costs are fully paid off. That's really important because today's opportunity is not only an opportunity for to grow and economic development, but infrastructure costs are really high. So you want to make sure that states aren't stuck with infrastructure costs that have been approved and then the industry goes away, or you have efficiencies in microchips that make data center loads much lower, than originally anticipated. And so today, across I think around 19 states, there are about 18 utility large load tariffs. Specifically, the number might even be larger now. Now, whether those are successful, however, is really about kind of the details of the tariff design and the details and quality of the oversight, right? And so that will always be a challenge in any sort of utility region. And I'll just quickly say, in fully deregulated states, policymakers have a little bit less tools, right? If load grows in wholesale markets, that generally permeates to wholesale prices, increasing that impacts all customer groups. And there have been some solutions that have been proposed. PJM's Independent Market Monitor proposed a bring your own generation requirement for data centers that would effectively, try to shield the load increase from the whole market. Similarly, some states have thought about, proposing in-state development requirements that require fully contracting power supply to load. In theory, these could work. It's a little unclear whether those will be consistent with equal access principles at FERC. And then one last tool is, states in deregulated markets can also increase the amount of state planning, procurement, and contracting that they do within these markets. I think this is something that was lost during deregulation. Just for context, the increase in capacity cost in PJM for the last three auctions was about $40 billion, just the delta in the increase. If that money had gone to pay off for new plants, you would have paid off around 13 gigawatts of new gas plants entirely. But most of that went into the existing generator, buckets. And so, I think there are creative ways in deregulated states, but we're still kind of testing what's possible.
Great. Thank you, Kasparis. And unfortunately, we've hit the top of the hour and we've run out of time to ask more questions. I think this was a very rich discussion. We could probably talk for hours about this topic, but really appreciate Puck, Jennifer, and Kasparis for helping us dive in a little bit today. And I know that this won't be the end. And apologies for not being able to dip into some of the audience questions, but please be sure to follow along with us as we continue to invest time and effort in diving into this content more and supporting stakeholders such as yourselves in the audience on how you're advancing affordability initiatives in your respective states. Well, with that, thank you so much for coming. Thank you to our panelists and to our speakers, and wanted to express a lot of gratitude for you all coming today. The recording will be on its way in the next day, and hope that you tune in to other RMI programming in the future. So thank you so much.